Time of the gentleman has expired. We'll now move to a second staff-led round of 30 minutes. Mr. Volker, I just have a few questions before I turn it back to Mr. Goldman. You testified in response to my colleagues in the minority something along the lines of a lot of people did not make the connection between Burisma and Biden. I think a lot of people have real difficulty understanding that. Tim Morrison testified that I think it took him all of doing a Google search to find out, oh, this is the significance of Burisma. It involves the Bidens. Are you saying during all this time up until the call you never made the connection between Burisma and the Bidens? You just thought that the president and Rudy Giuliani were interested in this one particular Ukrainian company?
Again, my role, Mr. Chairman, was just to get the meeting.
Well, I understand that, but my question is, are you saying that for months and months, notwithstanding everything Rudy Giuliani was saying on TV and all the discussion with Rudy Giuliani, that you never put Burisma together with the Bidens?
I didn't, and I wasn't paying attention to what Mr. Giuliani was saying on TV. We were talking to him directly.
Let me ask you this. Ambassador Volker testified yesterday to a similar epiphany, for lack of a better word. This is what he said. In hindsight, I now understand that others saw the idea of investigating possible corruption involving the Ukrainian company Burisma as equivalent to investigating former Vice President Biden. I saw them very different, the former being appropriate and unremarkable, the latter being unacceptable. In retrospect, I should have seen that connection differently, and had I done so, I would have raised my own objections. Does that sum up your views as well?
It does.
Now, I think you were asked a question with a bit of a incorrect premise by my colleagues in the minority about Fiona Hill saying that, referring to a drug deal between you and Mr. Mulvaney. It was Ambassador Bolton who made the comment that he didn't want to be part of any drug deal that Ambassador Sondland and Mulvaney were cooking up. No one thinks they're talking about a literal drug deal here or a drug cocktail. The import, I think, of the ambassador's comments is quite clear, that he believed that this bargain, this quid pro quo, as you've described it, over a meeting, the investigations to get the meeting was not something he wanted to be a part of. What I want to ask you about is, he makes reference in that drug deal to a drug deal cooked up by you and Mulvaney. It's the reference to Mulvaney that I want to ask you about. You've testified that Mulvaney was aware of this quid pro quo, of this condition that the Ukrainians had to meet, that is, announcing these public investigations to get the White House meeting. Is that right?
Yeah, a lot of people were aware of it, and
including Mr. Mulvaney.
Correct.
And including the Secretary of State.
Correct.
Now, have you seen the acting Chief of Staff's press conference in which he acknowledged that the military aid was withheld in part because of a desire to get that 2016 investigation you've talked about?
I don't think I saw it live. I saw it later, yeah.
So you saw him acknowledge publicly what you have confirmed too, that Mr. Mulvaney understood that 2 + 2 = 4. Is that right?
Well, again, I didn't know that the aid was conclusively tied. I was presuming. He was in a position to say yes it was or no it wasn't, because...
And he said yes it was, did he not?
He said yes it was.
Mr. Goldman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you again, Ambassador Sondland. We do appreciate your efforts to refresh your recollection through the documents, and we understand, we share your frustration in not having the documents to help guide this investigation. So we do appreciate those efforts. One of the documents that you provided to us goes back to the conversation you and the chairman were having about Mr. Mulvaney. And you had been trying for some time before the July 25th call to set up that call. Is that right?
To set up the call between President Trump and President Zelensky, yes.
Correct, yes. And I want to show you an email that you reference in your opening statement. That is a July 19th email. And who is this from?
It looks like is it from me? I don't know.
It's from you, I believe.
Yeah, it's from me to the group.
Now, who is the group?
People mentioned on the email: Blair, Kenna, McCormack, Mulvaney, Perry, Pompeo.
And who's Robert Blair?
I believe he's a deputy chief of staff or a advisor to the chief of staff.
And you've already told us that Lisa Kenna is the executive secretary for Secretary Pompeo. Who's Brian McCormack?
The chief of staff he was the chief of staff for Secretary Perry.
And then we see Mr. Mulvaney, Secretary Perry, and Secretary Pompeo. Can you read what you wrote on July 19th to this group, please?
He is prepared to receive POTUS call, will assure him that he intends to run a fully transparent investigation, will turn over every stone. He would greatly appreciate a call prior to Sunday so he can put out some media about a friendly and productive call, no details, prior to Ukraine election on Sunday.
So Sunday was the 21st, which was the date of the parliamentary elections in Ukraine, is that right?
That's right.
When you say will assure him that he intends to run a fully transparent investigation and will, quote, turn over every stone, unquote, what do you mean there?
I'm referring to the Burisma and the 2016/DNC server investigations.
Later that evening, Secretary Perry responds just to you and Brian McCormack, saying, Mick just confirmed the call being set up for tomorrow by NSC, RP. And then a little later, Mr. Mulvaney replies to all, saying, I asked NSC to set it up for tomorrow. Were these the only responses that you received to this email?
I don't know. If I have them, I would show them. I don't know.
No one wrote back to you and said, what are you talking about in terms of these investigations and turning over every stone?
No, there was a chain, and I don't know if it's part of this email or a subsequent email, where I believe Ambassador Bolton pushed back and said he did not want a call to President Zelensky made by President Trump until after the parliamentary elections.
So that would explain why it was moved from the next day, July 20th, to the 25th, right?
That's right.
But Ambassador Bolton is not on this email, is he?
I don't think he is, no.
Now, you were asked by Mr. Castor if there are any other key witnesses who might be able to help with our investigation. And you mentioned Brian McCormack, right, the Chief of Staff for Secretary Perry?
I did.
You are aware that the committee subpoenaed him, are you not?
I wasn't aware of that.
And that he refused to come testify? Are you also aware that Mr. Mulvaney was subpoenaed by the committee and refused to come testify?
I did read that in the newspaper, yes.
Are you also aware that Robert Blair was subpoenaed and refused to come testify?
I think I'm aware of that.
And that Secretary Perry was asked to come testify and refused?
I am aware of that as well.
So would you include them, as well as Secretary Pompeo, as key witnesses that would be able to provide some additional information on this inquiry?
I think they would.
Now, this was not the first time, as you indicated, that Mr. Mulvaney heard about these investigations into Burisma and the 2016 election. Is that right?
I don't know what Mr. Mulvaney heard or didn't hear. I think there's been a huge amount of exaggeration over my contact with Mr. Mulvaney. It was actually quite limited.
Well, he certainly he certainly indicated a familiarity with what you were talking about in this July 19th email. Is that right?
Right, because I think Mr. Mulvaney was in the May 23rd briefing with President Trump. I don't remember because there were people sitting behind us that were coming and going when we were sitting in front of President Trump's desk.
Okay. Now, you've said that you don't have a recollection of referencing Mulvaney in the July 10th meeting in Ambassador Bolton's office. Is that right? Or
I don't recall.
So when both Fiona Hill and Colonel Vindman testify that in response to a question from Ukrainian officials at that July 10th meeting about scheduling a White House visit, that you said, well, I spoke with Mr. Mulvaney and it will be scheduled after they announce these investigations. Do you have any reason to dispute that characterization?
I don't have any reason to agree or dispute. I just don't remember.
So if they both remembered it and they both then went and spoke to the NSC legal advisor about it, you would trust that whatever they relayed to the NSC legal advisor would likely be an accurate reflection?
Again, I trust that they related to the NSC legal advisor. I don't know whether I said it, and I don't know which conversation. Again, I've had very, very limited conversations with Mr. Mulvaney.
This email indicates that you spoke to President Zelensky and were relaying what he said to very senior officials. Is that right?
Which email again?
Sorry, the July 19th email, where you say, the subject is, I talked to
Yes.
Zelensky just now.
I've got it.
Was there some sort of assurance that President Zelensky needed to provide about what he would say to President Trump in order just to get the phone call?
I think that part was verbal, and then there were a lot of communications going around back and forth with the Ukrainians, and that's when someone, and I don't remember who, came up with the idea of a draft statement so there would be no misunderstanding about what, in fact, the Ukrainians would say and would be willing to say that we could rely on and negotiate something on a piece of paper.
So just to place you in time, we're going to get to that draft statement, which was in August. This is July 19th, before the July 25th call. Do you remember whether there was a need from any of the White House officials or other national security officials for President Zelensky to provide some assurance of what he would say to President Trump before a phone call, not the meeting, but a phone call was scheduled?
There was initially apparently a condition, but that condition was obviously dropped because the phone call took place and there was no such statement made. The phone call took place, as you said, on the 25th of July.
And when you say there was no such statement that took place, what do you mean?
Well, the Ukrainians never made their public statement prior to the phone call on the 25th of July.
Right, but we're not talking about a public statement. What I was asking is whether President Zelensky needed to relay to you or the other American officials that he would assure President Trump that he would do these investigations in a phone call.
In my email, I obviously had just spoken with him, and he being Zelensky, and he said that he was prepared to receive the call and he would make those assurances to President Trump on that call, and then presumably that would then lead to the White House meeting.
And you had been discussing this phone call for several weeks now, is that right?
Yes, I think with Volker, with Perry, with Giuliani through Volker and Perry.
And then right after you sent this email assuring the others that he will discuss the investigations and will turn over every stone, the Burisma in 2016 election investigations, Mr. Mulvaney responded that he asked to set up the call for the next day. Is that right?
That's what it says.
Now, let's go to that press statement that you were discussing in August. And you testified, I believe, that you understood that Rudy Giuliani was representing the president's interests with regard to Ukraine. Is that right?
That's what we all understood.
And when you all, who do you mean we all?
Secretary Perry, Ambassador Volker, myself.
In August, you and Ambassador Volker were coordinating with Andrei Yermak, the Zelensky aide, about a press statement. And I want to pull up some of the text exchanges that you were referring to, which, as you acknowledge, helps you refresh your recollection. Is that right?
And I think Taylor was involved in those initial discussions as well.
Well, he's not on any of these text messages, so perhaps he was. He does not remember that. But let's go to the first one. Is it working? On August 9th? There's an exchange between Ambassador Volker and you where you are discussing setting up, we'll try to bring it up in a second, but I'll just summarize for you. You're discussing trying to set up a White House meeting, here it is, and you say Morrison ready to get dates as soon as Yermak confirms. Mr. Volker, or Ambassador Volker says, excellent, how did you sway him? You said, not sure I did. I think POTUS really wants the deliverable. What did you mean there?
The commitment to do the investigations.
And how did you know that the president wanted the deliverable?
I don't recall. I may have had a conversation with him, or I may have heard it from someone else, but I don't recall, again, without all these records.
Going to the next exhibit, Exhibit 10, where, or August 10th, rather, this is between you and Andrei Yermak. What did you say initially in this exchange?
Hello? Good? Oh, no, that's Yermak. How was your conversation?
And Mr. Yermak responds, hello, good. My proposal, we receive date, and then we make general statement with discussed things. Once we have a date, we'll call for a press briefing announcing upcoming visit and outlining vision for the reboot of U.S.-Ukraine relationship, including, among other things, Burisma and election meddling and investigations. And you respond, got it. That was your understanding of what this statement had to say to satisfy Mr. Giuliani, is that right?
Yes.
And then ultimately to satisfy the POTUS deliverable?
Yes.
Now, the next day you write an email to Ulrich Breckbull and Lisa Kenna. Are you able to see that on your
Yeah, I can see it on
screen?
the screen, yeah.
Okay. What is the subject of the email?
Ukraine.
And can you read what you wrote there?
Mike, and I'm referring to Secretary Pompeo, Kurt and I negotiated a statement from Zelensky to be delivered for our review in a day or two. The contents will hopefully make the boss happy enough to authorize an invitation. Zelensky plans to have a big presser on the openness subject, including specifics next week.
And in your opening statement, you said that the specifics, what did the specifics represent?
The 2016 and the Burisma.
And when you say the boss, who do you mean by that?
President Trump.
And the invitation is what?
To the White House meeting.
And Lisa Kenner responds, Gordon, I'll pass to S, and S is Secretary Pompeo?
Correct.
Thank you, Lisa. Now, 2 days later, you have a text exchange with Ambassador Volker again. And this is at the end of it, but the earlier text, which we don't have here, you may recall, includes the press statement, the revised press statement that includes Burisma and the 2016 election. Do you recall that?
Yes, if I could see it, that would be helpful, but yes.
But you ultimately remembered that after your conversation with Mr. Giuliani, you did pass along a statement to the Ukrainians that included Burisma in the 2016 election. Is that right?
I think there were statements being passed back and forth between Volker, the Ukrainians, and others to try and negotiate acceptable language.
Mm-hmm. And ultimately, that statement was not issued, was it?
Correct.
And the White House meeting did not.
Still hasn't occurred.
Still hasn't occurred. But you certainly understood at that time, did you not, that it was the president's direction and instruction that a White House meeting with President Zelensky would not occur until President Zelensky announced publicly the investigations that the president wanted. Is that right?
That's correct.
And you now know that the investigations the president wanted was an investigation into the Bidens and an investigation into the 2016 election.
I know that now, yes.
I'm going to move ahead to August 22nd. And you wrote an email to Secretary Pompeo, directly to Secretary Pompeo, CCing Lisa Kenna with the subject of Zelensky. And could you please read what you wrote to Secretary Pompeo?
Mike, should we block time in Warsaw for a short pull-aside for POTUS to meet Zelensky? I would ask Zelensky to look him in the eye and tell him that once Ukraine's new justice folks are in place mid-September, Zelensky should be able to move forward publicly and with confidence on those issues of importance to POTUS and to the U.S. Hopefully that will break the logjam.
And Secretary Pompeo responds to you 3 minutes later, yes. Now, I want to unpack this a little bit. You said that in the middle, once Ukraine's new justice folks are in place. What did you mean by that?
The new prosecutor that was going to be working for President Zelensky, the old prosecutor, I believe his term was up or he was being let go. He was the Poroshenko prosecutor, and Zelensky wanted to wait until his person was in place.
So once that new prosecutor was in place, then President Zelensky, should be able to move forward publicly and with confidence on those issues of importance to POTUS. What did you mean by those issues of importance to POTUS?
Again, the 2016 election and Burisma investigation.
Were you aware at this time that Secretary Pompeo had listened in to the July 25th phone call?
I was not.
If he had, do you believe that he would fully understand what the issues of importance to POTUS related to Ukraine would be?
I mean, I can't characterize his state of mind. He listened in on the phone call and he concluded what he concluded.
But now that you've read the phone call, it's quite clear what the issues of importance to POTUS are.
Yes.
Biden investigation and
Yes.
the 2016 election investigation, is that right?
That's correct.
Then it says, hopefully, that will break the log jam. Now, by this point, you were aware that security assistance had been on hold for about 5 weeks, is that right?
I became aware on the 18th of July.
And you understood that there was a lot of activity within the State Department and elsewhere to try to get that hold lifted, is that right?
That's right.
Just about everybody in the interagency, meaning the national security apparatus, wanted to lift the hold and wanted the aid to go to Ukraine?
Correct.
So what did you mean here when you said logjam?
Well, as I said to Chairman Schiff, I meant inclusively anything that was holding up moving forward on the meeting and the Ukraine-U.S. relationship.
And what was holding that up?
At that point, it was the statements about Burisma and the 2016 elections.
But what was being held up?
Well, the aid was being held up, obviously.
4 days later, you said in your opening statement that you sent Rudy Giuliani's contact information to John Bolton, is that right?
I did.
Did you know why he asked for that?
No idea.
Did you know that he was going to Ukraine the next day?
I knew he was about to go to Ukraine. I didn't know exactly when his trip was, but I thought it was kind of an odd request, given that the White House can pretty much get anyone's phone number they want.
Now, in this email to Secretary Pompeo, you reference a trip to Warsaw. Ultimately, the vice president went on that trip?
That's correct.
And that was the conversation that you talked about, where you testified earlier to, that where you said that we really need to get these investigations from Ukraine in order to release the aid in the pre-meeting?
That's right.
And Vice President Pence just nodded?
He heard what I said.
And didn't respond in any way?
I don't recall any substantive response.
Okay. But you never specifically referenced the Bidens or Burisma in that meeting, did you?
I don't remember ever mentioning the Bidens. I may have mentioned Burisma.
And that meeting was with a group. You were not alone with Vice President Pence.
That's
is that
correct.
Right? And you know that at that bilateral meeting with President Zelensky, I believe you testified earlier, that Vice President Pence did not mention these investigations at all, right?
I don't recall him mentioning the investigations.
So that your testimony is just simply in a pre-meeting with a group of Americans before the bilateral meeting, you referenced the fact that Ukraine needed to do these investigations in order to lift the aid. Right?
I think I referenced, I didn't say that Ukraine had to do the investigations. I think I said that we heard from Mr. Giuliani that that was the case.
So that helped inform your presumption, correct?
Correct.
So it wasn't really a presumption. You heard from Mr. Giuliani.
Well, I didn't hear from Mr. Giuliani about the aid. I heard about the Burisma in 2016.
And you understood at that point, as we discussed 2 + 2 = 4, that
That's
the
right.
aid was there as well.
That was the problem, Mr. Goldman. No one told me directly that the aid was tied to anything. I was presuming it was.
Right. Well, I want to go ahead to, I'm going to go back on September 1st, or I'm going to jump actually ahead to September 7th, okay? When we discussed those text messages where you said there were multiple convos with President Zelensky and POTUS, you recall that?
Do you have the email by any chance?
We could try to pull it up in a second, but you don't remember I showed it to you
Yeah,
earlier this
go
morning?
ahead, though, with your question.
And you confirmed that that likely meant, as you said it did, that you spoke with President Trump. Is that right?
Again, if my email said I spoke with President Trump, presumably I did.
You are relying pretty heavily in your testimony on the texts and emails that you were able to review. Is that right?
That's right.
So certainly if someone else had contemporaneous texts, emails, or notes, you would presume that what they were saying was accurate. Is that correct?
Well, if they had texts or emails, I would. If they had notes, I don't know. Some people's notes are great, some people's aren't. I don't know.
But certainly it would be a helpful refresher to anyone's memory.
Including my own.
Now, you had a conversation on September 7th, according to both Ambassador Taylor and Tim Morrison, with Tim Morrison, where you told Mr. Morrison that President Trump told you that he was not asking for a quid pro quo, but that he did insist that President Zelensky go to a microphone and say that he is opening investigations of Biden and 2016 election interference, and that President Zelensky should want to do this himself. You don't have any reason to dispute both Ambassador Taylor's and Mr. Morrison's testimony about that conversation, do you?
No.
On September 8th, you then had a conversation directly with Ambassador Taylor about this same phone call, where Ambassador Taylor said that you confirmed that you spoke to President Trump, as he had suggested earlier to you, and that President Trump was adamant that President Zelensky himself, meaning not the prosecutor general, had to, quote, clear things up and do it in public, unquote. Do you recall, you don't have any reason to think that Ambassador Taylor's testimony based on his contemporaneous notes was?
I don't know if I got that from President Trump or I got it from Giuliani. That's the part I'm not clear on.
Well, Ambassador Taylor is quite clear that you said President Trump. Mr. Morrison is also quite clear that you said President Trump. You don't have any reason to dispute their very specific recollections, do you?
No, if they have notes and they recall that, I don't have any reason to dispute it. I just personally can't remember where I got it from.
And then you also told Ambassador Taylor in that same conversation that if President Zelensky, you told President Zelensky and Andrei Yermak that although this was not a quid pro quo, as the president had very clearly told you, it was, however, required for President Zelensky to clear things up in public or there would be a stalemate. You don't have any reason to dispute Ambassador Taylor's recollection of that conversation you had with President Zelensky, do you?
No.
And that you understood the stalemate referenced the aid, is that correct?
At that point, yes.
Ambassador Taylor also described a comment that you made where you were trying to explain what President Trump's view of this was. And you said that President Trump is a businessman. When a businessman is about to sign a check to someone who owes him something, the businessman asks the person to pay up before signing the check. Do you recall saying that to Ambassador Taylor?
I don't recall it specifically, but I may have.
And Ambassador Volker also said that you did.
Okay.
So just to summarize here, by the end of the first week of September, before the aid had been released, you had expressed twice to the Ukrainians that you understood that the investigations needed to be publicly announced on CNN in order for the aid to be released. Do you recall that?
I didn't say that they had to be announced on CNN. The Ukrainians said to me or to Ambassador Volker, or both of us, that they had planned to do an interview anyway on CNN, and they would use that occasion to mention these items.
And that even though at some point you had calculated 2 + 2 to equal 4, and therefore you believed that the aid was conditioned on the investigations, that you had a phone call with President Trump that you relayed to both Tim Morrison and Ambassador Taylor, whose accounts of that conversation you do not dispute, where President Trump confirmed that President Zelensky needed to publicly announce the investigations, or otherwise the obvious implication of the stalemate would be that the aid would not be released. Is that correct?
Again, the implication, I did not hear directly from President Trump that the aid would be held up until the statement was made. I did not hear those words.
But you agree that with whatever Mr. Morrison and Ambassador Taylor testified to about the conversation you had with President Trump, is that right?
Remind me again. I don't want to misspeak.
Well, you just said you have no reason to dispute their accounts based on their detailed notes.
Were they saying that I told them that President Trump said that the aid would not be released until the statements were made? Because I said repeatedly, I don't recall President Trump ever saying that to me.
Okay.
I think what they said, if I could just finish this line of questioning, was that President Trump was adamant that President Zelensky himself had to clear things up, quote, clear things up and do it in public, unquote. So what they related was, although President Trump claimed to you there was no quid pro quo, he also made it clear to you in that call that President Zelensky had to, quote, clear things up and do it in public. You don't have a reason to dispute, that's what you
I don't have any reason to dispute the clear things up and do it in public. What I'm trying to be very clear about was President Trump never told me directly that the aid was tied to that statement.
But in that same conversation you had with him about the aid, about the quid pro quo, he told you that President Zelensky had to, quote, clear things up and do it in public, correct?
I did not have a conversation with him about the aid. I had a conversation with him, as referenced in my text, about quid pro quo.
Well, the quid pro quo you were discussing was over the aid, correct?
No. President Trump, when I asked him the open-ended question, as I testified previously, what do you want from Ukraine? His answer was, I want nothing. I want no quid pro quo. Tell Zelensky to do the right thing. That's all I got from President Trump.
Did you also get from President Trump, as reflected by Ambassador Taylor, that he said he was adamant that President Zelensky had to, quote, clear things up and do it in public?
That part I can agree to, yes.
Time is now with the minority for 20 minutes. I'm sorry, 33 minutes.
33 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ambassador, you've been in business for a long time.
I have.
So if you want to get to the bottom of something, somebody that's running a department or one of your buildings or something, who do you go to?
The boss.
The manager of whatever company
Exactly.
it is. Right?
Correct.
So if you want to get to the bottom of foreign aid, probably go to the people that are in charge of foreign aid here in this town, wouldn't you? Because you're not in charge of foreign aid.
I'm not in charge of foreign aid.
And you've had to testify that you've presumed foreign aid was this or that, and you're guessing that this was tied to foreign aid. But there are people in this town who are in charge of the foreign aid. And in fact, I don't think it's very fair to you at all, or to us, or to the American people. You might be surprised that we had that person here in the Capitol, in a secret deposition, in the basement, last Saturday. Now, that testimony might be pretty important to you before you're here to testify. If you could have read that, your lawyers could have went through that, because it may have clarified some more things for you about your recollection about the foreign aid. So earlier we heard about we had the chair looking at the cameras telling American people, talking about Watergate with their Watergate fantasies that they continue to, I guess they fantasize about this at night. And then they come here and talk about obstruction of justice because they're not giving you documents that you think you should have. So now they've laid out their clear Watergate argument or articles of impeachment. So I just have to remind the gentleman, I know we're not in a court of law because you wrote the rules, the chair here did, but I would think it's obstruction of justice to not give the American people and give the ambassador the right to look at the transcript of the man who's in charge of the foreign aid in this town. Now, I could get into what he said, but the chair could release what he said. And we're not even allowed to call that witness here today. So let's talk about things that we do know are facts, okay, as best as I think you and I and most people know them. President Trump does not like foreign aid to start with. Is that correct, Ambassador?
I've heard that, yes.
And you've testified that watching over the EU, you have 28 countries, you have neighboring countries that you work with. One of his biggest complaints is the lack of participation that those countries participate in programs around the world. Isn't that correct?
That's correct.
Especially NATO,
Yes.
right? That's one of your, when you go down the list of the jobs when you get directions from the White House, when you first became ambassador, probably one of the number one things, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but on the top of the list was making sure countries pay their fair share, especially with NATO.
Yeah, and we have a very capable ambassador to NATO, so I'm not going to take her lane.
But it's one of the, but you work with those countries, it's one of the issues that you bring up in your meetings, correct?
It is.
So, now I know you weren't on the July 25th phone call, but one of the first things that the President of the United States brings up is Germany's lack of participation. I think he names the President of Germany directly, that they're not participating in helping out Ukraine, who's one of their neighbors. Is that what you read in the transcript?
I've heard that, yes.
So the whole idea that the president starting out with he doesn't like foreign aid, he doesn't think countries pay their fair share, that's looking out for the taxpayer. But there's more, and we talked about this in your deposition. We talked about it, about how we have requirements. The Congress writes requirements into the law that require you and all the diplomats to carry out the foreign policy of this country for the President of the United States. Before the president can certify foreign aid and send foreign aid, there has to be certification that there's no corruption. You're aware of that now?
I am now, yes.
So being that you learned about that in your deposition, now looking back at clearly the challenges and concerns the president had with the involvement of high-level Ukrainian government officials, including the ambassador here in the United States that attacked him during his presidential campaign, the concerns of leaks that were leaks or just made up stories and conspiracy theories that were spun in the Steele dossier that the Democrats on this committee own. They paid for it. Other DNC operatives that were working with the Ukrainian ambassador here in Washington, D.C. to dirty up your boss, the President of the United States. We're not going to hear from those witnesses. Just like we're not going to hear from the person we deposed on Saturday. We're not going to hear about what the real reason, the person who's in charge of making sure that foreign aid is delivered, we're not going to hear about what actually happened with the foreign aid. Wouldn't that have made it a lot easier for you to testify instead of guessing and doing little funny math problems up here, 2 + 2 = 4? It's great for all the viewers to hear that. Wouldn't it be easier if you just knew exactly why the foreign aid wasn't given?
It would have been easier to testify if I had a totality of the record.
And would you trust the person who's in charge of cutting the checks for foreign aid? the top career diplomat or the top career official?
I'd have no reason not to.
Thank you. Well, Ambassador, I don't know if we'll get to speak again if we have some more magical minutes, but I'm done with questions with you. I know the rest of our members have more questions. And let me turn to, I know Mr. Castor has some more questions.
Hello again, Ambassador.
Hi.
We'll try not to use all of this time as a courtesy to you. Just want to go through some distinctions between your opener and your deposition and some other witnesses. In your opening statement today, you said President Trump directed us to talk with Rudy, correct?
Correct.
But then you and I had a little bit of a back and forth about the president just said, talk to Rudy. And I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, you took that to mean if we wanted to move forward with these types of things, Rudy was the place to go? Rudy
was the guy.
Okay. But President Trump didn't direct you to talk to Rudy, correct?
It wasn't an order. It was, if you want to work on this, this is the guy you got to talk to.
Ambassador Volker in his deposition said, I didn't take it as an instruction, but just as a comment. Talk to Rudy. You know, he knows these things. And you've got some bad people around him. I mean, that, referring to the Ukrainian. So, I mean, Ambassador Volker hasn't testified that there's any sort of order or direction to talk to Rudy.
I don't know what he testified. It became very clear to all three of us that if we wanted to move the relationship forward, President Trump was not really interested in engaging. He wanted Rudy to handle it. And as I said in my opening statement, Secretary Perry took the lead and made the initial contact with Rudy, and that's when we began working with him.
And as to the question of whether Mr. Giuliani was expressing the desire specifically of the President of the United States, in your deposition, you said, I don't know. I don't know if this was coming out of Rudy Giuliani irrespective of the President. Correct?
Yeah, I'm not going to dispute what I said in my deposition.
Okay.
That's true, yeah.
And we walked through all your communications with Rudy Giuliani, and they're not a lot, right?
Correct.
Ambassador Volker in his deposition on the same question said, I did not have that impression. I believe Mr. Giuliani was doing his own communications. And, you know, granted, Mr. Giuliani had business interests in Ukraine, correct?
Now I understand he did. Okay. I didn't know that at the time.
With Messrs. Parnas and Fruman, correct?
A lot of new names I've learned.
Okay. And you had never met with those folks?
No.
Okay. And then in your September 9th communication with the president, during your deposition, that was a striking moment when you walked us through your telephone call with President Trump on September 9th.
And by the way, I still cannot find a record of that call because the State Department and the White House cannot locate it, but I'm pretty sure I had the call on that day.
But whether it was the 9th or the 8th, yeah, you had this call. It was extremely memorable, right?
It was.
And you've been very honest, and we're not trying to give you a hard time on all the times you don't recall. We're just trying to say that there's a lot of important events that have happened that the committee's asked you about, and you've honestly said, I don't recall. But the call with President Trump on September 9th or the 8th, you recall it vividly, right?
I recall it vividly from Ambassador Taylor. I had, again, prior to that call, had all kinds of theories as to why things weren't moving, why there was no White House meeting, why there was no aid, why there was no this, why there was no that. And I was getting tired of going around in circles, frankly. So I made the call, and I asked, as I said, the open-ended question, what do you want from Ukraine? Right. And that's when I got the answer.
He was unequivocal, nothing.
What I said in the text is what I heard.
And I'm curious, was that vignette in your opener today?
I don't think so.
How come? That's so memorable, so striking.
I don't know. It was in my previous testimony, and I assumed if people had questions, they would bring it up.
Okay. I mean, this is an example. You know, a lot of witnesses during the course of this investigation have dealt with ambiguities in different ways, and some have resolved them in the light least favorable to the president over and over again. This is an exculpatory fact, shedding some light on the president's state of mind about the situation about the,
And I'm happy to discuss it.
Yeah. So I'm just wondering why you didn't mention it in your opener.
There were so many things I wanted to include in my opening, and my opening was already, I think, 45 minutes or something. It would have been an hour and a half. There are a lot of things I'd like to have mentioned.
Okay, but you only had a couple conversations with the president. And we're trying to evaluate whether
It was not purposeful, trust me.
Okay. Talking about striking conversations, Mr. Holmes, when he came here last Friday in the basement, I'll tell you, he thought your conversation that you had with the president was like the most memorable thing he's ever experienced.
How many conversations has he had with the president?
He probably hasn't had any. But he was energized, enthusiastic about telling us about this conversation. And
So not only did I buy him lunch, but I also provided entertainment?
Yeah, and he conferred with us that he regaled anyone that he came across with this story. And that's, I guess, a
Great
discussion for Thursday. But other than the colorful language, and he was definitely moved by the color, but he was unequivocal that you brought up the Bidens in the post-call discussion. And he said something to the effect of the president's only interested in big things, and Mr. Holmes said that, there's a lot of big things going on in the Ukraine, like there are. There's a war. Ukraine's under attack from the east by Russia. And he puts words in your mouth to the effect of, no, the president only cares about investigations like Rudy is pitching about the Bidens. And what's important about this is the day after the 725 call. And what's reported by Mr. Holmes, and you, to the extent you've confirmed it, isn't anything different than happened on the 725 call. Agreed? From the president's standpoint?
With 2020 hindsight, now that we've had the transcript of the call, the Bidens were clearly mentioned on the call, but I wasn't making the connection with the Bidens.
Right, but with regard to the president, it was just mentioning investigations.
That's all he said on the phone was investigations, I think.
But you told us time and again that you never realized the Bidens were part of any of this, the Burisma, and you talked about a continuum, and you never came to understand that until maybe as late as September 25th, correct?
I don't know the exact date, but it was pretty late.
Okay. And Ambassador Volker said the Bidens never came up after his one breakfast meeting with Mayor Giuliani, where he testified that he tried to disabuse the mayor of anything relating to the Bidens.
And I think Secretary Perry publicly stated that he never heard Biden either until the end.
So when you testify here today that you have no recollection of mentioning the Bidens to Mr. Holmes, that's not just a recollection, that's based on your state of mind at that point in time and your state of mind up to September 25th, correct?
I wasn't into investigating the Bidens.
Okay. So it's very surprising to you that he would mention that, right?
It was very surprising to me.
I want to go back to a couple things in your statement. This July 26th meeting with President Zelensky, earlier in the day from this lunch time event we've been talking about. During the course of the meeting with President Zelensky, did any of the parties discuss what came up on the telephone call?
I don't believe so.
Okay, so President Zelensky didn't express any concerns about the content of the call, right?
I mean, all I heard about that call was that it was a good call. It was friendly, everyone was happy, I was delighted to hear that so that we could now move to the next phase, which was the meeting.
Okay, so you can tell us with certainty that nobody talked about demands in that meeting of fulfilling the president's demands?
I don't remember exactly. Again, this is a great example, Mr. Castor, of where I would have loved to have seen the notes from the meeting. I didn't take any notes, but I know there were notes taken. But I don't remember any heated conversation in the meeting. I remember it being a really, really friendly, good meeting. And that's why I said what I did to the president the next day, which was, you know, Zelensky will do whatever you want. He's very happy.
And you don't remember any discussion by President Zelensky of lamenting how he had to navigate this difficult situation, right?
I don't know. I know that was in the whistleblower complaint, something about navigating something. I didn't remember anything like that.
I want to get back to your...
Gentlemen, yield to a second.
Of course.
Which would be another helpful thing also, Ambassador, is if we actually had heard from the whistleblower and we had testimony of the whistleblower. Then you wouldn't have to be up here speculating as much and guessing, because you would have a source that would have been interviewed. We have his complaint. We could have matched it up with your testimony along with the people from OMB that would have made it very easy for you to testify, so you wouldn't have to just try to remember all this stuff and chase conspiracy theories around that the Democrats have continued to lay out for the last 6 weeks, moving from quid pro quo to extortion to bribery to where are we at today, obstruction of justice, and now back to quid pro quo. We wouldn't have had to do all that if the whistleblower would have testified. You wouldn't have to speculate about what the whistleblower only had in his or her complaint that nobody seems to know. Yield back to Mr. Castor.
Thank you, Mr. Nunes. I want to turn to a couple of times in your opener, you said everyone was in the loop. And I just want to, you know, these televised proceedings, sometimes we lose track of things, and you know, everyone was not in the loop with your speculation or your guess that in the absence of any credible explanation for the suspension of aid, I later came to believe that the resumption of security aid would not occur without public statement from the Ukraine. Everyone wasn't in the loop with that, right?
Well, the secretary was, because that's why I sent my email.
But your emails, let's look at your emails. There's 2 emails that you sent to the secretary, right?
Mm-hmm.
Better here?
August 22nd,
Right, and August 11th?
August 11th.
So the August 11th email, we went through this before. I'm sorry to go through it again. You said to the secretary, Kurt and I negotiated a statement from Z to be delivered for our review in a day or 2. The contents will hopefully make the boss happy enough to authorize an invitation. Z plans to have a big presser on the openness subject next week. A couple things here. This is only relating to the White House meeting, correct?
Yes, I believe so.
And this is only, this is just investigations generally, making a public statement of openness generally, right?
Well, I think by August 11th, Mr. Castor, I think we were talking about 2016 in Burisma. The investigations generally was really early in the...
Okay, but do we know that Secretary Pompeo knows that?
I think so. I think...
Why?
Well, only because I think Counselor Breckbull was briefed on all of these things. And
by who? By you?
By, I believe, Ambassador Volker, by myself.
That's not what he testified to. I mean, did you?
Ambassador or Counselor Breckbull testified? I didn't know he had testified.
No, Ambassador Volker.
Oh, okay.
He didn't testify that he briefed Mr. Breckbull. I mean, this email to the secretary is talking about this statement, which, by the way, I mean, you said Kurt and I negotiated a statement, and the statement never went.
Didn't go anywhere.
Yeah, Ambassador Volker said it wasn't a good idea. Mr. Yarmark said it wasn't a good idea. But what you're writing to the secretary here is just it relates to a generic openness subject, right?
Yeah, but I think the secretary, though, was on the July 25th call, which obviously I wasn't on and I didn't know about.
Okay, but you used this email to suggest that everyone was in the loop, that like security sector assistance was tied to some sort of act by the Ukrainians.
No, I don't think I said that, I don't think I said that this assistance was involved here. I think I was,
So what was everyone in the loop about then?
well, the secretary was in the loop that we had negotiated a statement.
Okay.
I'm fairly comfortable that the secretary knows that where the statement was at that point, in other words, the 2016 in Burisma, and that Lisa passed that along to
Okay.
him and kept him informed.
Okay, so we can agree that at this point in time, the secretary wasn't in a loop, that there was a conditionality on the security sector assistance.
Hold on a second. Are you asking about July 19th, Exhibit 4?
I was asking about your email to the secretary on August 11th.
Oh, okay.
There's,
Well, on July 19th, which the secretary was on, I talked about fully transparent investigation and turn over every stone. And the secretary was on that.
okay.
So,
But you testified at your deposition that on July 19th, in this continuum you talked about,
yeah.
at that point in the continuum, it was just a generic investigation. Wasn't anything involving,
I think it went, again, I'm not trying to put words in anywhere. I think it went from the original generic from, May 23rd when we left the Oval Office. We're talking about corruption and oligarchs until Mr. Giuliani started to become involved, and then it transitioned into the Burisma.
you hadn't even talked to Giuliani by that time. This is July 19th.
Mr. Castro, with all respect, will you allow him to finish his answer?
Sorry, use the mic.
Will you allow him to finish his answer?
Of course, I apologize.
We were communicating with Mr. Giuliani through Secretary Perry and through Ambassador Volker. I wasn't talking to Mr. Giuliani directly.
Okay.
Until after August 1st.
But as of July 19th, weren't we still on the generic part of the continuum?
I don't know. I believe by then we were talking about Burisma in 2016, to be candid.
But not Biden.
No, not Biden.
Okay.
No.
And then turning to your email of August 11th.
Yeah, got it.
I'm sorry, we just dealt with that. August the 22nd.
22nd?
Yeah, it's page 23 of your opener.
Yeah, I got it.
And this is where you were requesting a pull aside for the president, and this is when the president was
He was still going to go.
going to
yes.
go, it was before the hurricane.
Right.
Bumped that off his schedule. I would ask Zelensky to look him in the eye and tell him that once Ukraine's new justice folks are in place, Zelensky should be able to move forward publicly and with confidence on those issues of importance to the president and the United States. Hopefully that'll break the logjam. And at this point in time, the issues of importance to the president of the United States were what?
The 2 investigations.
Okay. But nothing to do with Vice President Biden, right?
Again, I didn't make the connection then.
Okay. I want to just pivot briefly to the president's concerns about foreign assistance. Under Secretary Hale, who will be with us later today, testified that during this relevant time frame, there was a real focus to re-examine all federal aid programs. Are you aware of that interest of the president?
I'm generally aware of the president's skepticism toward foreign aid and, conditioning foreign aid on certain things. I'm generally aware of that, yes.
And Ambassador Hale testified, and his testimony's been public, almost a zero-based concept, that each assistance program and each country that receives the program be evaluated. The program made sense, that we avoid nation building, and that we not provide assistance to countries that are lost to us in terms of policy, whether it's because corruption or another reason. Is that something you were aware of at the time?
Generally, yes.
Okay. And you're certainly aware that the president was concerned about the European allies' contributions to the region?
Exactly why I was involved.
Okay. So, as we get down to September 11th, right before the, you're advocating that the pause be lifted, correct? But
Yeah, I personally didn't think the pause should have ever been put in place.
Okay.
Yeah.
But as we get down to September 11th and you're talking with Senator Johnson and so forth, you don't know with certainty that the genuine reason the president was implementing the pause wasn't because of his concerns about the allies or his concerns about foreign assistance generally, or that he wasn't just trying to hold the aid as long as he could to see what he could, what type of information he could get about those two subjects.
Fair enough.
Okay. I am really trying to finish up before so I can yield some time back. Do we have anything else, Mr.?
I have nothing else.
Thank you. Yield back.
Chairman yields back.
Back the balance of our time.